Shalom, and welcome to the second lesson of our new series, Kings and Prophets, Divided Heart, a Divided Nation. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that this will most likely be the very last new series to appear on my YouTube channel. After this 8-week series, all new material will be posted to a Rumble account. I also want to let you know that the student sheet for this lesson is available through the link right below this video. So, I have a question to ask you. What is the very first thing that you need to be successful? I mean, even before you have any kind of a plan or any kind of an idea, what do you need to be successful? I think before you really even get started on anything, you have to have the desire to be successful. Because people tend to have really great plans, but they either never get them started because they're just kind of convinced themselves that they're going to fail anyway, so why even bother? Or they start, they get discouraged, and then they quit. Well, the second thing you need to do is you really need to define what your success is going to look like. Is it a big house with a lot of cars? For one of our kids, they'll be successful, they said, when they have a house and a hot tub and a dog and a cat and 2 cars. Some people may define success as just being able to work hard and to save so that now you can live in this little cabin in the woods and your grandkids can come and visit you, but the rest of the world just kind of leaves you alone. For some people, just living to see 70, still on your feet. Maybe then you'll define your life as successful. Well, what we're going to unpack today is Solomon's measure of success. And then we're going to see how we can apply those measures to our very own lives. So before we actually get started into our scripture for today, I'd like to take a few minutes to look at this relationship between 1st and 2nd Kings and the books of Chronicles, because we are studying them together and in parallel. Well, if you'll remember, even before Kings or Chronicles was ever written, way back to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy was the second giving of the law that God gave to the Israelites back in the book of Exodus. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, he's giving this law to that generation who wasn't there when he gave it the first time. So God wanted them to know what he expected before they actually went in and possessed the promised land the very first time. Well, you can kind of see then how even Deuteronomy kind of parallels Chronicles, because Chronicles was written sometime after the southern kingdom was taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Now, we don't really know who wrote Chronicles, but some scholars believe that it was Ezra. Now, the reason for 1st and 2nd Chronicles was so that returning remnant who would rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem would have their instructions. It contained lessons God didn't want them to forget. He didn't want them to repeat their past, so he wanted them to know about it. He didn't want them to forget as they went in to the land he promised them. He wanted them to know better so then they would do better. I mean, if you think about it, what's the entire point of Scripture to begin with? Because God wanted us to know his expectations. He wanted us to know better so then we as believers would do better. So now, if you just kind of remember from our study from last week, in 1 Kings chapter 1, Adonai exalted himself. He tried to abdicate Solomon's throne, but Solomon ended up being appointed king. In 1 Kings chapter 2, David died, and it said that Solomon's kingdom was firmly established. And in both chapters, what we see is we see Solomon demonstrating his wisdom when he deals with several different people. So in 1 Kings chapter 3, where we're going to begin today, in chapter 3, we're also going to look at chapter 4. You may want to flip over to 1 Chronicles 1 and just kind of stick a bookmark or stick your finger in if you're not taking notes, just because we're going to flip back and forth to see the parallels between these two chapters. So going back to 1 Kings chapter 3, the first 3 verses, in these verses we see that Solomon's kingdom is already established. But if you flip to 2 Chronicles 1:1, it shows the relationship that God and Solomon had. It said that God was with Solomon and exalted him, or God is the reason that Solomon was great. But if you read a little further into the first 2 verses of 1 Kings chapter 3, we kind of get a little worried about Solomon, because he makes this political or this strategic alliance with the king of Egypt by marrying his daughter. And when we read that, what are some of the first thoughts that go through your mind? I can tell you what I thought. I thought, whoops, here we go, Solomon, down that slippery slope. And then we looked at verse 3. And verse 3 says that Solomon really loved God, and he was really following in his footsteps, except he was making sacrifices and burning incense on the high places. Now, if you've ever studied with me before, if you've ever studied scripture before, we associate those high places with places of pagan worship. But in technicality, the word high places is Bama. And it's a technical name, yes, for a cult platform, but it could actually be a place of any kind of worship. It could also mean like a ridge or a literal high place, like a mountain or even a battlefield. But when we look further into Scripture and when we unpack into Scripture, looking at verses 3 through 9 in 1 Kings chapter 3 and even in 2 Chronicles chapter 1 verses 2 through 10, we see this actually wasn't a high place or a place of pagan worship. This high place in Gibeon held something very significant and very special to the Israelite people. That's where the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, that's where it was. And with it was the bronze altar. So to that place, Solomon and the people made 1,000 sacrifices at the tabernacle in Gibeon. Why? Why did they have to go all the way to Gibeon? Some biblical maps show that Gibeon was as close as 7 miles away. Some put it at 15 miles, a little northwest of Jerusalem. But in one map I looked at, it said it was a full 3 days walk from Jerusalem into Gibeon. So why in the world, can you imagine getting it together, bringing 1,000 sacrifices to the tabernacle in Gibeon? But why wouldn't they just sacrifice in Jerusalem? Easy, simple answer. There was absolutely no house of God that had been built in Jerusalem. Solomon had yet to build God's temple in Jerusalem. But there was something very interesting. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't in the tabernacle in Gibeon. It was actually in Jerusalem, right exactly where David had brought it. So how in the world did this tabernacle and altar get to Gibeon and the Ark of the Covenant wind up in a tent or a house, a shelter in Jerusalem? Well, if you go back in scriptures, you'll see that originally the tabernacle and the altar were actually in a place called Shiloh, which is way up north. But because of Israel's idolatry, God abandoned Shiloh. And the Philistines actually managed, when the Israelites moved the Ark of the Covenant, the Philistines actually managed to steal it. And then we can follow through Scripture this long trek that the Ark of the Covenant made. Well, eventually David did get it back, and it was returned to Israel, but it wasn't taken back to Shiloh and put back in the tabernacle. Because if you read further on, it seems like Shiloh was actually destroyed. Now, Scripture never specifically says that it was destroyed, but it does make a lot of references to make us believe that that's actually, what did happen. And we really don't know why, and we don't know how, but the tabernacle ended up moving to Gibeon during David and Solomon's time, but the ark stayed in Jerusalem. So in the beginning of Solomon's reign, the tabernacle and the altar were somewhere between 7 miles and 3 days walk in Gibeon, but the Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem, and it was covered. So when Adoniah and Joab fled and held on to the altar that we read about last week, they actually made, at minimum, a 7-mile run for their life, this mad dash to the tabernacle in Gibeon with Solomon in hot pursuit. Then if we look further down in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 through 9, and then paralleled to 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 7 through 9, we see something very interesting. We see what actually happened after Saul and the people finished making their 1,000 sacrifices to God. God appeared to Solomon in a dream, and he asked him a really simple question that may or may not actually be really simple. He said, "What can I give you?" Wow, what can I give you? And that brings us kind of to our first kind of reflective application. If God came to you and said, "What can I give you?" what would you ask for? Now, if you've read these verses and then you know what Solomon's going to ask for, you could say, oh, I would ask for exactly what Solomon asked for. I'd ask for wisdom, and then God would give me everything else. So what you're really after then is the everything else that Solomon got for asking for wisdom. But what would you really ask for? Would you ask for an easier life? Would you ask for all the money in the world? Would you ask for a bigger house? Would you ask for maybe a more understanding boss, or maybe to get rid of your boss so that you can be boss? Would you want to get rid of all your enemies? What would you actually ask for if God came and said, you know what can I give to you? Well, Solomon didn't start out by giving God a big list of things that he wanted. The first thing he spoke of was God's loving kindness, his chesed, his mercy, that God had already shown to his father David. Then he humbled himself, and he spoke of being God's servant, and he understood that it was God who actually gave him his kingship. And then he made his request to God. Now in 1 Kings chapter 3, 7 and 8, listen to Solomon's desire to be successful. It says, "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I'm but a little child. I don't know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or to be counted." So David's saying, God, I want to be a successful king. I want to be successful, but I don't even know how to be successful. You put me in charge of all these people, of this numerous amounts of people and this huge land. But God, I don't know how to do it. I want to be successful, but I don't know how to do it. Now, what we're typically taught that Solomon asked for is wisdom. And in 1 Chronicles, that's exactly what it says that he asked for. But in 1 Kings chapter 3, look what he asked for. He asked for an understanding heart that could discern good and evil. Now that understanding heart isn't a heart that understands all of the politics of being a king or of the justice or of the money exchange or the political stuff that he would need to know. That's not what he wanted to understand. This understanding heart is Shema. He wanted a heart that would hear and listen and obey. And only by hearing and listening and obeying could he discern, could he beam, could he act wisely, and could he understand. Now there's a real simple formula that I like to think about that discerns the difference between knowledge and wisdom and discernment. Knowledge is just to understand something, just to have general information. Like my mama says, I know a whole lot about nothing. Wisdom, however, is the correct application of your knowledge. So how are you going to apply the things that you've learned? And then discernment is to take that application and use it correctly based on your wisdom. A really easy way to remember this is, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is actually a fruit. Discernment is not putting it in your fruit salad. So here we see Solomon's definition of success. He knew there was no way that he would be successful. He wanted to, but he knew he wouldn't be able to on his own volition. He didn't even know how to go out, and he didn't even know how to come back in again. It was too overwhelming. So this is his definition of success. That he would rule and lead God's people according to God's statutes by having a heart that hears, that listens, and that obeys the word and the voice of God. So, how do you define success? Do you even expect it? But when you figure God into your life equation, what actually can happen? What are the possibilities when you go to God and say, I can't do this on my own, God, but I want to hear and I want to obey so that I will act wisely according to your words, according to your plan, and according to your way. And when you go to God for that, when that's your definition of success and you let God lead, wow, I mean, can you even fathom the possibilities? Well, I can guarantee you Solomon didn't. In verses 10 through 15 of 1 Kings 3 and 2 Chronicles 1, verses 11 through 13, we see God's response to Solomon. First it says God was very pleased. But when he was very pleased, he gave Solomon over and above what he asked for. And then we see that he made him wise. He had a discerning heart. And wise is chakam. It's to be wise ethically and religiously, and then your actions follow your words. Your halacha is good. Your walk follows your talk. But he also gave him riches beyond imagination and honor, kavod, honor, reputation in absolute abundance. And he was known throughout all of the known world, not just in Israel. He was the richest, wisest man to ever live. 1 Chronicles 14 through 17 actually lists some of his amazing wealth. But then after Solomon woke up, look what he did. He didn't stay there in Gibeon and offer his burnt sacrifices and his peace sacrifices. He actually went back to Jerusalem, stood before the Ark of the Covenant, and there offered his sacrifices to God. Why? I think for two practical purposes. Number one, the Ark of the Covenant represented the very presence of God. So he went to offer in the presence of God sacrifices to God. Now, I don't believe he actually stood physically in front of the Ark of the Covenant, but I do believe that there was probably an altar outside this tent or this house, this shelter that the Ark of the Covenant was in. And I'm very certain it had a door that closed to it that didn't expose it to everyone and didn't expose everyone to it. And so standing out there in front of where the Ark of the Covenant was, Solomon made his offerings to God. Moving down through verses 16 through 28, this is probably one of the most remembered, at least in my memory, my life of growing up in church, the most memorable lesson or verses of scripture that probably known for everybody. And what happened? Two women came to Solomon, and they were harlots. And they both had a baby within a week of each other. One rolled over and suffocated her baby. And so in the middle of the night, she stole the other woman's baby and put her dead baby next to her, and she took the live baby for herself. And when they woke up, the one lady looked at the baby and realized that wasn't her baby. That was the other lady's baby. So they both went to the king and they both presented their cases, and they both went on about, who was the mom of the dead baby and who was the mom of the live baby. And King Solomon said, "Bring me the live baby." And he ordered the baby to be cut in half. And so the real mother jumped up and said, "No, don't cut my baby in half. I would rather someone else raise my child than for my child to stand here and for me to watch it die." So then Solomon knew who the real actual mother was. And in 1 Corinthians 18, chapter 1, verses 18 through 2:16, we're obviously not going to read it because it's almost 2 full chapters. In 1 Corinthians 1, we actually see wisdom. And what 1 Corinthians says, what Paul wrote to the Corinthians in his first letter to them is, the wisdom of the world looks at God's wisdom as completely foolish. It's just dumb to them. But the converse ought to also be true, that those of us who see God's wisdom and who claim to understand God's wisdom and live under God's wisdom, we need to look at the wisdom of the world and see it as foolish. But the issue becomes when those of us who know better don't do better. And so we start looking at the wisdom of the world. We studied last week about godly versus ungodly wisdom. We start looking at the wisdom of the world and say, wow, you know what? That really makes sense. Or we start to think, that's actually a better way to live. That's actually wiser. That makes more sense than the way I'm living now. But the Bible is very clear to say, you can't know God when you look through the world's wisdom. If you're on the side of the world and you're believing in their wisdom and you're living in that ungodly wisdom, then you can't know God. It says Jesus actually became God's wisdom to everyone who believes. So, which wisdom are you about? If you come under the headship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, do you see the world's wisdom as foolishness? And no matter what people say, and no matter how dumb people think that you are, the way that you live your life, are you willing to continue living it regardless? So let's jump back to 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. This is really just a really long, lengthy explanation of Solomon's royal cabinet. It's who is going to do what and who Solomon hired to do different jobs. Now, in verse 4, we see somebody we didn't quite expect. Because in that it says that Solomon appointed Zadok and Abiathar to be priests, when we know that as of 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 35, Abiathar was stripped of his priesthood. So why here is he listed as being one of the priests? Honest answer, I don't know. I looked, I broke my own rule and looked at different commentaries, and I couldn't really find one that made any sense. So I don't know. If you find a good answer or you believe, you have a good explanation, be sure to leave it in the comments below. I'd actually really love to hear from some of you about it. Going on down in verses 7 through 28, we see Solomon appointed 12 deputies. They're not sav. It means to take a stand or to be set over or to establish. So the best guess is that these 12 men, these natsabim, more than one deputies, were men that Solomon put in charge of different regions in the kingdom. And their job, they were pretty much provision collectors. They were responsible for collecting provisions from the people who lived in that region at once a month or every month, so once a year, and then those provisions went to feed the king and his family and his guests and everything that they would need for an entire month. But my goodness, in verses 20 through 21, Listen to what it says of chapter 4. It says, Judah and Israel were numerous as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. Now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms, from the river, which was the Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and they served Solomon all the days of his life. Just those verses, what are those actually a fulfillment of? It's a fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, that the people will be as numerous as the stars and the sand from Genesis 22, 15 through 17. It also tells us the boundaries of the promised land, and they are exactly the boundaries that we see in the Abrahamic covenant. So we know that during Solomon's reign, Israel actually owned or lived in all of their Abrahamic covenant land. And unfortunately, after Solomon's rule, they would never live or possess all of their covenant land again, even to this day in 2021. In verses 22 through 28, I was astounded at what it took to feed Solomon's household for just one day. It took 30 cores, which is about 300 bushels of fine flour, 600 bushels of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep, and then who knows, but it just says, and deers, gazelles, roebucks, fattened fowl, for one day. And that wasn't all. These provision collectors, these deputies, also had to collect enough from their people, the people who live there, from the citizenry, enough to also feed all of Solomon's horses in 40,000 stalls and his 12,000 horsemen. Now, you know they could not grow enough in 1 month and store up enough in 1 month to be able to provide all of these provisions to Solomon's household, his slaves, his horsemen, his horses. Now, I've got to think, there were 2 growing seasons, so they probably saved, for the rest of the 11 months to be able to give Solomon and provide for Solomon for that 1 month. But if they were able to do that and then save enough for their families and for Israel to continue to prosper, that ought to blow your mind to the amount of food that Israel was able to grow and the vast amounts of land that Israel was able to build these storehouses in order to preserve their provisions. This in itself speaks to the success and the riches of Israel under the rule of King Solomon. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10 through 17, God had already warned them before Saul even became king. God told him that, hey, if I give you a king, they're going to take some of your sons and some of your daughters, and some of your crops and your servants and your flocks, and they're going to use it for their own use. And the people said, we don't care. We want a king. And now they're on their 3rd king. And I doubt very much that Solomon came up with this all on his own. His father David probably did this. Saul probably did it. It was the only way the king's household was ever going to be provided for. And then in 4:29 through 34, look how Solomon is described. That honor, that kavod, that reputation was known throughout all of the nations. It says he spoke 3,000 proverbs and he wrote 1,005 songs. Proverbs chapter 1 and Psalm chapter 72 were actually both written by Solomon. In them, he prayed for righteousness for himself, for vindication and salvation for the needy and the oppressed, and for abundance and for blessing. But he also acknowledged that he couldn't be the one to provide for them. It had to come from God. So here's our next set of application questions. Do you consider yourself wise? Where's your wisdom come from? And what do you do with that wisdom? When you pray, what do you pray for? Do you pray for God to gift you with amazing talent that will make you successful by the world's standards? Or do you, like Solomon, pray for a heart that hears and obeys God? So I hope this lesson's given you some things to think about as we walk on this uncertain path of 2021. If you're studying with us and you don't have a book, you can actually prepare for next week's lesson by studying 1 Kings chapters 5, 6, and 7, and 2 Chronicles chapters 2, 3, and 4. So be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for instant notifications of when new videos are posted, and stay tuned for even more information of our new Rumble channel. So until next time, Shavua Tov, have a great week. Shalom, shalom.